Hello there, and welcome back to KY Night Horror. Today, we will be diving into 3 chilling hospital encounters. 1. The Silent Room. Nurse Linda had worked the night shift at St. Augustine Hospital for nearly 5 years. The old hospital, established in 1904, had long been a source of eerie stories and unsettling rumors. The West Wing had been abandoned for decades due to structural issues and lack of maintenance. Yet, strangely, it was still part of the building. Over the years, whispers had circulated among the staff about the ghostly happenings in the West Wing, but it was largely ignored, as most assumed it was simply a collection of tall tales. Linda had grown accustomed to the hospital's occasional oddities, the flickering lights, the whispers from empty rooms, the strange noises in the walls. It was all part of the atmosphere of this ancient place. But tonight was different. She had just returned from a break when she received an unexpected call from her supervisor. A last-minute patient needed immediate observation, and Linda was asked to take charge of the West Wing. Linda had heard the stories before. The West Wing had been closed to patients for years after the tragic death of a young woman, Amelia, who had died in room 203. Amelia had suffered a severe illness, and her final days had been agonizing. Rumor had it that her death had been mysterious and gruesome, leaving an indelible mark on the hospital. Since her passing, staff members occasionally reported hearing strange noises in the hallway or seeing unexplained shadows near her room. Linda wasn't particularly superstitious, but tonight, as she made her way through the silent halls, the old building seemed to pulse with a life of its own. The walls were coated in the peeling paint, and the scent of mildew lingered in the air. She made her way to room 203, her footsteps echoing in the empty corridor. As she passed the door to room 203, she thought she heard something, a whisper. She stopped and listened, but the sound quickly faded. She shrugged it off, thinking it was simply the wind or the creaking of the old building. She had heard such sounds 1,000 times before, and they never bothered her. But tonight, something felt different. The air felt heavier, thicker with the weight of the past. Linda continued her rounds, but the whispers followed her, soft, almost inaudible, but undeniably there. Every time she passed room 203, the voices seemed to get louder. Her heart began to race as she realized the sound was coming from within. She hesitated at the door. The West Wing had been sealed off for years, and no one had entered room 203 since Amelia's death. But tonight, the door was slightly ajar, just enough for her to hear the whispers. With a mix of apprehension and curiosity, Linda pushed the door open. The room was as she expected, dusty and untouched. The bed was neatly made, the furniture covered with sheets to protect it from the elements. Yet the whispers were louder now, almost as if they were coming from the very walls themselves. "Get out, before it's too late." The voice was soft but distinct, and it sent a chill down Linda's spine. She looked around the room, but there was no one in sight. The air felt cold, and the room seemed to darken, as if the shadows were growing deeper. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. She should leave. She should turn around and get out, but something kept her rooted to the spot. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind her with a force that shook the room. Linda gasped, her breath catching in her throat. She ran to the door and tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. Panic set in as she pulled on the handle, but the door remained locked. She was trapped. The room seemed to grow colder, and the whispers grew louder, now a cacophony of voices, all urging her to leave. But Linda couldn't move. She was frozen, her mind racing as the darkness around her deepened. She glanced at the bed, and that's when she saw it. A figure was lying there, covered in the same white sheets. But the shape beneath the sheets wasn't quite right. The outline was too still, too unnaturally perfect. Slowly, Linda's breath caught in her throat as the figure began to stir. The sheet shifted, and Linda could see the faint outline of a face beneath. It was pale, with hollow eyes and a mouth that seemed to be silently mouthing something. She couldn't make out the words, but it didn't matter. The figure was staring at her, its hollow eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her blood run cold. Before she could react, the whispers erupted into a deafening roar, overwhelming her senses. She screamed, but no sound escaped her lips. It was as if the room itself had swallowed her voice. The lights flickered wildly, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears, but the sounds of the voices drowned it out. Then the figure in the bed began to rise. Slowly, it pulled itself up, its movements jerky and unnatural. The sheets fell away, revealing a pale, emaciated form with blackened veins running across its skin. The figure's eyes locked onto Linda, and a chilling smile spread across its face. It spoke, its voice raspy and cold. "You shouldn't have come." Linda stumbled backward, her feet tripping over the dusty floor as she struggled to escape. But the figure was already standing, moving toward her with unnatural speed. It reached out with a skeletal hand, its fingers long and twisted, and grabbed her arm. Suddenly, the door flew open. Linda stumbled into the hallway, her heart racing, and she found herself face to face with a nurse from the main ward who had heard her screams. But when they turned back to the room, it was empty. Room 203 was silent once again, the door now firmly shut, as if nothing had ever happened. Linda was never seen again. The next morning, the hospital staff searched the entire building, but there was no sign of her. Room 203 remained locked, and the whispers had ceased. But some say that on certain nights, if you listen closely enough, you can still hear Linda's screams echoing down the long, empty halls of the West Wing. Story 2. The ghostly patient Dr. Harrison had seen his fair share of strange cases during his time at Blackthorn Hospital, but nothing compared to the mystery of the woman who kept reappearing in the psychiatric ward. It started as a routine case. A frail woman who had been admitted for severe malnutrition and exhaustion. Her name was always different, and her background was a blur. But each time she was admitted, she was treated, only to vanish within hours as if she had never existed. The first time Dr. Harrison saw her, she was unconscious in room 12, her body wasting away, as if all life had been drained from her. The hospital staff had tried every treatment, but her condition did not improve. And yet, when Dr. Harrison checked on her the following day, she was gone, her bed neatly made, as if she had simply disappeared into thin air. Dr. Harrison was baffled, but he assumed she had been discharged in the night. That was until the next night, when she reappeared again in the same room, under a different name, but with the same frail, sickly appearance. She looked worse, her skin pale and mottled with bruises. This time she was conscious, but her eyes were vacant, almost lifeless. The woman spoke to Dr. Harrison in a hoarse whisper, her voice barely audible. "I never left. I never will." Dr. Harrison thought it was a result of her condition, a delusion perhaps, but there was something in her voice that sent a shiver down his spine. He checked her vitals again, but they were stable. In fact, they were better than the night before. It was as if she had made an incredible recovery overnight. Yet something didn't add up. When Dr. Harrison returned to the room the following morning, the woman was gone once again, but this time he felt an overwhelming sense of dread. It was as if she had never been there at all. The room was cold and empty, and the air felt heavy, oppressive. The strange occurrences continued. Every night the woman would appear, only to disappear the next morning. Sometimes her condition would worsen, and other times she seemed to recover completely. No one could explain it. The hospital records were inconsistent, with no trace of her ever being discharged. Then, one night, Dr. Harrison entered her room and found her sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at him with hollow eyes. Her skin was now translucent, her features gaunt and sunken. She looked like a corpse, but she was still alive, somehow. "I can't leave," she whispered. "I've been here for so long, trapped." Before Dr. Harrison could respond, the lights flickered, and the room grew cold. The woman's body began to deteriorate rapidly, her flesh peeling away, leaving only skeletal remains. Her eyes locked onto Dr. Harrison, and she smiled, a smile full of malice and sorrow. "I never left," she repeated, her voice now a hollow, echoing wail. Dr. Harrison stumbled backward, horrified by the sight. He tried to run, but the door wouldn't open. The room was closing in on him, the walls seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, and the woman's voice echoed louder, filling his mind. She had never left, and neither would he. The next morning, Dr. Harrison was gone. The hospital staff searched the entire building, but found no trace of him. His office was unlocked, his personal belongings left behind, but he had vanished. The ghostly patient was never seen again. But every year, on the anniversary of Dr. Harrison's disappearance, the staff hears whispers coming from the empty room. The same whispers that once came from the ghostly woman. I never left. Story 3. The Echoing Footsteps. Emily had only been a nurse at Blackthorn Hospital for a few weeks, but she had already heard the stories. Blackthorn was an old, decrepit building, and it had its share of dark secrets. The psychiatric ward, in particular, was said to be haunted by the spirits of past patients, those who had died within its walls, their souls forever trapped in the hospital. Emily had always been skeptical of ghost stories, but that night something felt different. She had been assigned to the night shift, and the hospital was eerily quiet. The only sound was the distant hum of the ventilation system. As she made her way down the dark corridor of the psychiatric ward, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. That's when she heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps echoing down the hall. Slow, deliberate steps that seemed to follow her every move. Emily froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She looked around, but the hallway was empty. The footsteps grew louder, and then they stopped. Emily's breath caught in her throat. She turned and looked down the corridor, but there was no one there. The footsteps started again, only this time they were closer. They were right behind her. She spun around, but still, there was no one in sight. The footsteps continued, moving faster now as though they were chasing her. Emily's pulse quickened, and her legs turned to lead as she tried to move toward the exit. But the hallway seemed to stretch on forever, the door just out of reach. And then, as if the footsteps were getting closer with every step she took, she heard something even more terrifying, a cold, clammy hand resting on her shoulder. Emily turned quickly, but the hallway was still empty. The footsteps were now running toward her. She turned to run, but her feet felt like they were stuck in place. The sound of heavy breathing filled her ears, and she could feel something moving in the shadows, closing in on her. The heavy footsteps grew louder, faster. She could almost feel the weight of each step reverberating in the floor beneath her, and the sensation sent chills through her spine. She spun around again, desperate to find something, anything, to explain this nightmare. There was nothing. The hallway was as empty as it had been before, the faint flicker of overhead lights casting shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally. And then she heard it. A voice, soft at first, almost a whisper, but unmistakably clear now. "You shouldn't have come." The words echoed in the air, carried by the unseen presence that had been stalking her. Emily's body trembled as she stood frozen in place, unable to move, her mind racing for a rational explanation. But there was no explanation. She knew, deep down, that something far more terrifying than her own imagination was at work here. The sound of the footsteps stopped. A cold hand suddenly gripped her shoulder, its touch icy, sending a shock of terror through her. She gasped, spinning around, but there was no one behind her. Yet she could still feel the pressure of the hand lingering on her skin. The presence was there, just out of her sight, but so close that she could sense it, feel its malevolent gaze on her. Her eyes flitted from one end of the hallway to the other, but it was like being trapped in a nightmare where the end was never in sight. The hallway stretched endlessly in both directions. The air was thick with an oppressive weight, as if the hospital itself were alive and watching her. And then, just as suddenly as it had all begun, the footsteps returned, louder, more forceful than before, pounding toward her with terrifying speed. Emily took a step back, her heart hammering in her chest. The walls seemed to close in even tighter now, and the air felt colder, as if it were sucking the warmth from her very body. She reached out for the nearest door, but it was locked. The footsteps were right behind her now. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she spun around to face the relentless noise. And then, from the darkness, a figure emerged. It was a man, or at least it looked like one, but his features were distorted, twisted into something unnatural. His eyes were hollow, blackened, and his mouth was stretched into a twisted grin that seemed to mock her very existence. His hands were long and skeletal, reaching toward her with a slow, deliberate pace. "No one ever leaves," the figure rasped, his voice chillingly hollow. "No one." Emily tried to scream, but no sound came out. Her throat was paralyzed with fear. The figure moved closer, the footsteps echoing in her ears, as if they were now a part of her, resonating in every fiber of her being. She tried to run, but her legs wouldn't respond. She stumbled, falling to the cold floor as the figure loomed over her. The last thing Emily saw before everything went black was the figure's hollow eyes staring down at her, his smile stretching impossibly wide. His voice, now low and menacing, whispered one final warning: "You're ours now." The next morning, the staff found Emily's uniform discarded in the hallway. There was no sign of her anywhere in the psychiatric ward. Her disappearance was as inexplicable as it was chilling. No one had seen her leave. The doors remained locked. Her colleagues searched the entire hospital, but it was as if she had vanished into thin air. That night, the footsteps started again. Faint at first, then louder, coming from the same hallways where Emily had disappeared. And they never stopped. The whispers echoed, calling out in the silence of the darkened halls. The staff, now terrified, avoided that section of the hospital entirely. But every now and then, a lone nurse or orderly would walk through that part of the building, only to return with pale faces and trembling hands, muttering about the footsteps. And every year, without fail, they would hear the sounds grow louder. Some said it was Emily's restless spirit, forever chasing the footsteps that had taken her, now doomed to wander the halls of Blackthorn Hospital for eternity. Others said it was something far darker, an entity that fed on fear, waiting for its next victim. No one ever stayed in that hallway alone after dark. No one ever dared to listen for the footsteps again. But sometimes, if you walk the hospital at night, you might hear them, slow, echoing footsteps, growing nearer and nearer. And you'll know you're not alone. That's all for this video, and have a good night.